December 18th, 1944, near Stavelot, Belgium. Snow drifts across the road like ghostly smoke. The morning is grey, bitterly cold, and filled with the smell of exhaust and cordite. German panzer grenadiers crouch beside their half-tracks, rifles slung low, their breath fogging through scarves stiff with frost. Ahead of them, the once silent Ardennes forest now echoes with the distant thump of artillery. A convoy crawls forward the lead vehicle, a Kübelwagen, bearing the black cross of the Wehrmacht and a red pennant fluttering from its fender. Inside sits Oberst Hans von Schönberg, commander of the 105th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, his gloved hands gripping a field map spread across his knees. The dim morning light catches the sharp line of his jaw and the iron cross pinned to his overcoat. He had fought in Poland, France, Russia, and somehow survived them all. But this, he knew, was different. This offensive Hitler's last gamble was not about victory. It was about survival through miracle. Fuel, Schönberg muttered, scanning the snow-dusted map. We'll need more fuel, or we'll die in the forest before we see Liège. His adjutant, a young lieutenant with frostbitten cheeks, nodded without meeting his eyes. Everyone knew the truth. Their panzers, relics of earlier triumphs, Panthers, Panzer Force, and a handful of Tiger IIs were running on fumes. The German offensive that had burst across the Ardennes 3 days earlier was already slowing, not because of enemy fire, but because the tanks were thirsty and the depots were empty. The men had begun siphoning fuel from wrecked American Shermans, even from abandoned trucks. A single Tiger could guzzle 500 liters in a day. And yet, orders from higher command from Sepp Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army demanded that Schönberg push forward toward the Meuse. "Hold the line until we reach Stavelot," came the latest radio transmission. "Capture enemy supplies if available. Every drop counts." Schönberg folded the map, his decision already made. He would take Stavelot, or what was left of it, by any means necessary. The road narrowed as the column approached the outskirts of the town. The American retreat had been hasty, violent. Burned-out jeeps and half-tracks lined the ditches, their metal frames still warm from fire. A Sherman tank lay on its side, turret split open, its treads half buried in the snow. As they passed, one of the grenadiers spat into the snow beside it. "Look at this," he muttered. "The Yankees leave everything behind." Schönberg said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the tank. Inside its open hull, the smell of scorched rubber and flesh mixed into something unforgettable. They reached the edge of Stavelot at noon. The town's stone buildings were shattered, roofs caved in, windows blown out by artillery. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys of houses still smouldering. A church bell cracked, and hanging at an angle clanged softly in the wind. Then came the sound Schönberg had been waiting for, the heavy clank of a Tiger's treads on cobblestone. The lead tank, Tiger 205, rolled into view, its 88mm gun sweeping the street. The commander, a grizzled sergeant named Weber, popped his head from the turret. "Road clear ahead, Herr Oberst, but there's something odd down by the rail yard." "What kind of odd?" Schönberg asked. Weber hesitated. "You'll want to see for yourself, sir." The rail yard was a mile beyond the town square, down a long incline bordered by snow-choked hedgerows. Schönberg's boots crunched through the frost as he led his staff forward. What they saw at the bottom stopped them cold. An American supply depot. Dozens of trucks, still intact, sat parked in neat rows beside warehouses draped in camouflage netting. Some bore bullet holes, others frost-covered tarps. But what made Schönberg's breath catch was what the trucks carried: barrels of fuel, stacked 3 high, and marked with the white stencil of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. A few of his men broke into a run, shouting with joy. One, laughing uncontrollably, banged his rifle on a drum and yelled, "Petrol! It's petrol, Herr Oberst!" Schönberg raised a hand. "Check it first," he ordered. "If the barrels are full, mark them. If empty, leave them." They pried open the lids. The scent hit them instantly, sweet, sharp, unmistakable. Gasoline. The lieutenant grinned. "Sir, this could fuel the whole regiment." But the fuel was only the beginning. As the men explored deeper into the compound, they found warehouses filled with food, medical supplies, winter uniforms, and ammunition. Inside the largest hangar, rows of crates stretched into the shadows, tins of meat, chocolate bars, sacks of flour, boxes of cigarettes, even Coca-Cola bottles, stacked like treasure. One soldier pulled a can of peaches from a crate and turned it over in his hands, like a relic from another world. "They live like kings," he whispered. Another found a shelf lined with medical morphine and bandages enough to outfit a field hospital. Schoenberg walked among them, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The cold bit through his greatcoat, but he hardly felt it. Everywhere he looked, there was abundance, an obscene, effortless abundance. His men tore into boxes, laughing, cheering. They opened tins of meat with bayonets, gulped down chocolate, passed cigarettes around like trophies. The mood was jubilant like looters in Rome. But Schoenberg didn't share their laughter. He stopped in the middle of the warehouse, staring at the rows of untouched supplies stretching toward the far wall. His hands trembled slightly. It wasn't just the food or the fuel. It was what it represented. The Americans had abandoned all this, not because they were outmatched, but because they could. They could lose this much and still fight tomorrow. They could leave behind what Germany could no longer dream of producing. A young grenadier, still chewing chocolate, approached him. "Herr Oberst, we've found more radios, boots, even typewriters. What should we take?" Schoenberg didn't answer. His eyes were locked on a single crate marked U.S. Army Quartermaster Depot, Liège. He exhaled slowly and said, almost to himself, "We've already lost." The young soldier frowned. "Sir?" Schoenberg turned to face his men still laughing, still tearing open American rations with frozen fingers. "Can't you see it?" he said quietly. "They can fight forever." For a moment, the men fell silent. The sound of the wind filled the space, whistling through broken windows. Then, somewhere outside, a tank engine coughed to life, and the spell broke. Orders followed, methodical, efficient. The fuel was to be loaded, the food distributed, the trucks repaired. But even as his men worked, the Oberst felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He looked up at the high rafters of the warehouse, at the frost-covered steel beams that creaked under the cold. It was a cathedral, he realized, a cathedral to industrial power. The altar was not ideology or courage, it was production. And on that altar, Germany had already been sacrificed. By nightfall, the depot was half empty. The regiment had taken what it could, loaded trucks, and fueled tanks. But Schoenberg lingered as the last of the fires burned low. He stood beside a row of empty drums, the smell of gasoline heavy in the air. From somewhere in the distance came the muffled thunder of artillery. American, he thought. They were coming back. He drew his pistol and checked the chamber, out of habit. Then he looked down the dark road toward the western horizon, where the war and the truth waited. "We've stolen a day," he said softly, to no one in particular. Nothing more. Snow began to fall again, gentle and endless, covering the tracks of retreating men and machines. And the warehouses stood silent, full of plenty, untouched by victory or defeat, the quiet monument to a war already lost. December 19, 1944, Stavelot, Belgium. The storm had rolled in overnight, blotting out the stars. Thick, wet snow fell in curtains, smothering the ruins of the little Belgian town and softening the jagged edges of war. The American depot, the same treasure trove that had sent Schoenberg's regiment into euphoria just hours earlier now, sat like a ghost under the storm, its outlines blurred by snowfall. But inside the commandeered railway office, Oberst Hans von Schoenberg sat alone at a wooden desk, a kerosene lamp flickering beside him, his mind heavy and restless. The faint light carved deep shadows into his face, the creases of fatigue, the haunted focus of a man realizing that the line between triumph and futility had vanished. His gloved hand rested on a half-eaten tin of American stew. It had gone cold, congealed fat hardening on top. Around him, the sounds of the night leaked through the walls, boots crunching outside, a radio crackling with static, the distant rumble of tank engines warming for the next push west. A single sheet of paper lay before him, a situation report. Fuel, enough for one more day's march. Ammunition, half spent. Men, exhausted, frostbitten, many now sick. He leaned back and exhaled slowly. The depot they had captured, that miracle of chance, had bought them time. But time was no longer Germany's ally. He could still hear the laughter from his men the night before. They had torn open cans of Spam, eaten chocolate by the handful, toasted with bottles of Coca-Cola like it was champagne. They sang, loudly and badly, their voices echoing off the warehouse walls. For one night, they were boys again, not soldiers in a dying army. But Schoenberg had seen the truth behind their laughter. He'd seen the mountain of abundance, food, medicine, fuel, radios left behind by an enemy that never even stopped to collect it. The Americans weren't running out of supplies. They were overflowing with them. At dawn, the first trucks began to roll out, engines rumbling, exhaust plumes rising into the icy air. The convoy stretched for nearly half a mile, captured American vehicles, now flying makeshift swastika pennants on their mirrors to avoid friendly fire. Schoenberg climbed aboard the lead truck, wrapping his scarf tight against the cold. His driver, a young corporal named Keller, grinned as he shifted into gear. "Feels strange, doesn't it, Herr Oberst?" Keller said, patting the steering wheel. "American steel drives better than our own." Schoenberg offered a faint smile. "Everything they build seems to last longer." They drove north, toward Trois Ponts, where the road forked west toward the Meuse. But before long, the snow thickened, visibility dropping to almost nothing. Keller hunched forward, squinting through the windshield, the wipers smearing ice instead of clearing it. Ahead, the column slowed a bottleneck, forming near a blown-out bridge. A Tiger tank had stalled halfway across, its treads locked in ice. Men clustered around it, shouting orders, trying to free the machine. Schoenberg climbed down to inspect the situation, boots sinking ankle-deep into the snow. The smell of diesel hung in the air. The Tiger's crew was frantic, their gloves slick with grease. "Hydraulic line frozen solid," the tank commander barked. "We need antifreeze or it's no use." The Oberst nodded grimly. "We'll find some. Check the captured trucks, they must have carried maintenance kits." A soldier jogged off toward the convoy, disappearing into the snowfall. Schoenberg turned back toward the Tiger, its great barrel aimed westward like a finger pointing toward a dream. That dream, Hitler's Wacht am Rhein offensive, was supposed to split the Allied armies in two, recapture Antwerp, and force a truce on German terms. But standing there, surrounded by broken machinery, Schoenberg felt the absurdity of it all. The German army didn't have the fuel, the manpower, or the air support to finish what it had started. Every mile westward brought victory closer on paper and destruction closer in reality. He looked again at the frozen Tiger. It was a symbol of their entire war, a marvel of engineering, unstoppable in theory, but crippled by the very perfection that made it so. By noon, the convoy had stopped again, this time by order. A forward reconnaissance unit had intercepted radio chatter from the Americans. They were reorganizing faster than anyone had expected. The 30th Infantry Division was already moving in from the north, and Patton's Third Army, the monster everyone feared, was pivoting northward from Luxembourg with terrifying speed. Schoenberg gathered his officers around a spread-out map in the back of a supply truck. The wind howled outside, the canvas walls flapping like sails. "They're counter-attacking sooner than we thought," said Major Reinhardt, his voice tense. "If we don't reach the Meuse by the 21st, the entire offensive collapses." Schoenberg traced the lines on the map with a gloved finger. "We won't reach the Meuse," he said quietly. The men looked at him, startled. "Sir, we have fuel now," one protested. Enough for a day," Schoenberg interrupted. "2, if we ration it. And then what? We'll have tanks and no fuel, men and no food, radios with no batteries. Look around you." He gestured toward the snow-covered road outside, where the convoy sat idle, engines idling low, black smoke curling into the white sky. "The Americans are fighting with machines. We are fighting with hope." There was silence. The only sound was the steady hiss of snow on canvas. Major Reinhardt finally spoke. "You think the war is lost, don't you?" Schoenberg looked him in the eye. "No," he said. "I know it is." That night, the snow stopped, leaving behind a still, frozen silence. The sky cleared, revealing a moon so bright it seemed almost cruel. The convoy bivouacked in a small clearing near the edge of the forest. Fires burned low, men huddled in groups, their breath hanging in the air like smoke from unseen guns. In one corner, a squad passed around a tin of American coffee, steaming in the cold. They laughed softly, trying to warm themselves on memories of home. Schoenberg stood apart from them, watching the dark tree line beyond the firelight. He could hear distant artillery, faint but steady, the echo of a world closing in. He thought of Berlin, of the ruined streets and bombed-out train stations. He thought of his wife, Elise, and their son, Peter, last seen in 1943 when the boy was 12. He wondered if they were still alive beneath the rain of Allied bombs. The war had begun as a crusade, he reminded himself. They had believed in destiny, in a 1,000-year Reich, in restoring Germany's honor. But the further they pushed, the more hollow those words became. Now, standing here in the frozen Ardennes, surrounded by stolen food and borrowed hope, the truth was undeniable. The enemy's strength wasn't in ideology or courage. It was in production endless, mechanical, terrifying production. They could replace every bullet, every truck, every man. Germany could replace nothing. A shout broke his thoughts. From the darkness came Keller, running toward him, breathless. Herr Oberst, you must see this. He followed the young man to a nearby ridge, where the road sloped down toward the valley. There, under the moonlight, he saw it, a river of movement, stretching as far as the eye could see. Headlights, dozens of them, hundreds. American vehicles, trucks, jeeps, tanks, crawling eastward like a tide. Keller's voice trembled. How can they have so many? Schoenberg didn't answer. The sight said everything. They were an ocean, and he was standing on the shore. He turned back toward the camp, where his men slept around dying fires, unaware of the future rolling toward them. He felt the weight of command pressing on his chest, heavier than the war itself. Tomorrow, they would move again, maybe fight, maybe retreat. But the outcome had already been written in steel, oil, and numbers. He looked up at the moon, pale and pitiless above the Ardennes. God forgive us, he whispered, for thinking we could stop them. The snow began again, light and endless, erasing the tracks of both victors and defeated alike. The war still raged, but for Oberst Hans von Schoenberg, it was already over. December 20 et 1944 near Trois Ponts, Belgium. Dawn rose pale and cold over the snow-blanketed Ardennes, washing the forest in a dull silver light. The sound of distant artillery carried across the valley deep, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something vast and unstoppable. For 3 days, Oberst Hans von Schoenberg's regiment had struggled forward, burning stolen fuel, fighting ambushes, and slipping through the ever-narrowing noose of Allied resistance. The road to the Meuse, once painted as Germany's path to salvation, had become a graveyard of frozen trucks, abandoned tanks, and dead horses stiff with frost. Schoenberg stood at the roadside beside a stalled Panther tank, its hull coated in ice. A mechanic knelt nearby, hammering at the engine block with a wrench that rang like a funeral bell. "Leave it," Schoenberg said quietly. "Strip the parts we can use and burn the rest." The mechanic froze, then nodded. He understood. Behind them, a line of infantry trudged through knee-deep snow, rifles slung low, their breath rising in clouds. Their once proud grey uniforms were filthy now, patched, frayed, and soaked with cold. Some wore American boots taken from corpses. A young soldier, no more than 17, stumbled as he passed, his boots slipping on the icy road. Schoenberg reached out instinctively and caught him by the arm. "Steady, son," he said. The boy looked up, eyes hollow with exhaustion. "Herr Oberst, are we still advancing?" Schoenberg hesitated. The boy's question was innocent, desperate. "We are holding," he said finally, "until we know where the front truly lies." The boy nodded and kept walking. Schoenberg watched him go, a child soldier in a dying army, and for the first time in his long career, he felt the sting of guilt deeper than any wound. By midday, the snow began to fall again, heavy and relentless. The wind cut through greatcoats like knives. Orders arrived by radio, garbled, frantic from divisional command. American counterattacks in Bastogne and Malmedy. Patton advancing north, all units to dig in. Patton. The name moved through the ranks like a curse. Major Reinhardt joined Schoenberg in the ruined shell of a farmhouse serving as their command post. The walls were half collapsed, the windows blown out. A single iron stove burned weakly in the corner, surrounded by men warming their hands over the feeble flames. "We're cut off," Reinhardt said grimly. "The bridge at Stavelot's been retaken. We have no line of retreat. Schoenberg stared at the map spread on a table dotted with red arrows marking the American advance. His gloved fingers brushed the edges, tracing the front that was closing around them like a tightening fist. How many tanks are still operational? 5 Panthers, 1 Tiger, but low on ammunition. Trucks are half empty, men are half starved. Schoenberg nodded slowly. Then we hold here. Reinhardt frowned. Hold? Against Patton's army? The Oberst met his gaze. We hold, because we have no choice. Outside, the wind screamed across the open fields. The war, once a grand offensive, had devolved into survival. That night, the storm returned with vengeance. Snow lashed sideways through the shattered windows, extinguishing the stove's weak glow. The men huddled together in silence, listening to the artillery that rolled like thunder through the valley. Schoenberg sat apart, writing in his field journal by the light of a candle stub. The ink froze as it touched the paper. Our victory was never in the guns, he wrote. It was in the illusion that we could still make them faster than the enemy. Today, I saw what happens when that illusion dies. He paused, staring at the page. His hand trembled. We are fighting ghosts, ghosts made of steel and fuel and numbers. By morning, the first shells landed. The initial bombardment was distant, dull concussions that shook the frost from the rafters. Then it came closer. Artillery shrieked overhead, followed by the crash of impacts tearing through trees and buildings. Take cover, Reinhardt shouted. Men scrambled from the farmhouse into the snow, diving into foxholes and ditches. Explosions ripped through the fields, geysers of earth and ice rising skyward. Schoenberg crouched behind a fallen beam, pressing his back to the cold wood. Splinters rained down. Through the chaos, he could hear the rhythmic drumming of tank treads. Not German, these were heavier, faster. American Shermans. A sergeant nearby shouted, "They're coming through the forest." The reply came in machine gun chatter. Muzzle flashes lit up the tree line, tracer rounds slicing the air like fiery threads. German rifles answered, but the sound was weaker, thinner, like pebbles thrown against iron. Within minutes, the first American tanks broke through. They came in lines, barrels swiveling, infantry following in close formation, shadows in white winter camouflage. "Fall back," Reinhardt yelled, his voice raw. "To the ridge." Schoenberg ran through the storm of snow and smoke, boots slipping, heart pounding. Bullets snapped past his ears, kicking up sprays of ice. Around him, men fell, some crying out, others silent. He reached the ridge, overlooking the valley, just as the Tiger tank roared to life, its 88mm cannon belching fire. One Sherman exploded in a plume of smoke and flame. For a heartbeat, the German line held. But then came the return fire, 3 Shermans coordinating like clockwork. Their rounds struck in unison. The Tiger's turret cracked open, flames spilling from its hatch. The explosion was deafening. Schoenberg flinched, eyes stinging from the heat. He saw the Tiger's crew scrambling out, their coats ablaze before collapsing into the snow. "Mein Gott," Keller whispered beside him. The Oberst didn't answer. He couldn't. The roar of the tanks drowned out everything, even thought itself. By late afternoon, the shooting had stopped. The Americans had pulled back to regroup, leaving behind wreckage and silence. Schoenberg's regiment was broken. Fewer than 100 men remained, scattered, shell-shocked, hollow-eyed. Smoke drifted over the ruined fields, where tanks burned like dying furnaces. He walked among the survivors, helping where he could. A medic bandaged a soldier's frozen hand. Another man sat in the snow, staring blankly at nothing, whispering his mother's name. Reinhardt approached, his face grey. "Orders from division," he said. "We are to withdraw east. The offensive is over." Schoenberg nodded, though the words barely registered. "What about the wounded?" "There's no transport left. They say to leave them." Schoenberg looked at him sharply. "We don't leave our own." Reinhardt hesitated, then nodded. "We'll take who we can." The Oberst turned to the men, his voice hoarse but steady. "We're leaving, but not like thieves. Help the wounded. Salvage what you can. We move before dark." The men obeyed, weary but loyal. Even now they followed him. That night they marched east through the forest, leaving behind the valley where so many had fallen. The snow swallowed their footprints almost as soon as they made them. In the distance, the horizon glowed orange, the fires of Stavelot, La Glaise, Malmedy, the dying embers of the Ardennes offensive. Schoenberg paused once on the ridge to look back. The valley stretched below, littered with the wrecks of both armies, burned Tigers and Shermans lying side by side, indistinguishable in the snow. He thought of the fuel depot, the food, the abundance they had once touched. For a brief moment, they had stolen America's wealth. But it hadn't mattered. They could not steal its infinity. He whispered the words again, the same ones from that warehouse days ago. They can fight forever. Then he turned toward the east, into the dark. The snow fell heavier now, erasing everything, the road, the war, the illusion of victory. And somewhere behind him, the echo of engines rolled through the valley once more, not German, but American, advancing without pause, without exhaustion, without end. December 28th, 1944, east of the Honsfeld River, Belgium. The last of the snow had hardened into a crust of ice. It cracked under every bootstep as Oberst Hans von Schoenberg led the remnants of his regiment through the darkened forest. There were no more songs, no shouted orders, only the whisper of the wind through skeletal branches and the distant growl of engines that no longer belonged to them. The men moved like ghosts. Their grey uniforms had faded to white with frost, helmets dusted with rime. A few carried rifles, most carried nothing at all. The Army of the West, Hitler's final gamble, was dissolving into the frozen trees. Schoenberg kept walking. His body ached with exhaustion, but duty, that stubborn old ghost, still drove him forward. Somewhere ahead lay the German border. Behind him, the Ardennes offensive was collapsing into chaos. He glanced at the compass dangling from his neck. East, always east. The direction of retreat, of home, of failure. Behind him, the rhythmic clatter of footsteps broke the silence. Major Reinhardt caught up, breath steaming in the frigid air. "They've broken through at Bastogne," the major said, voice hoarse. "Our flank's gone. Command says the Americans are pushing all the way to Huffelise." Schoenberg didn't slow his stride. "Command says many things. How many men do we still have?" 67, including the walking wounded. The Oberst nodded. "Then we're a company now, not a regiment." Neither man spoke for a long time after that. The silence between them was heavier than the snow. At dusk, they stumbled into a small Belgian hamlet, 3 stone houses, 1 barn, and a chapel missing its bell. The villagers had fled days earlier. The hearths were cold, the windows shattered. Schoenberg ordered the men to take shelter. Fires were forbidden, smoke drew aircraft, but even the most disciplined soldiers needed warmth. Inside the barn, straw and manure mingled with diesel fumes from an abandoned tractor. The men huddled together, wrapped in blankets, boots steaming from melted snow. Someone produced a dented tin of American coffee found in one of the trucks. The smell alone seemed to lift spirits. For a few minutes, laughter returned, quiet, hollow, but real. Reinhardt approached the Oberst, crouching beside him on an overturned crate. "We can't keep moving without food," he said softly. "There's a supply column somewhere near Streetvith. If we can reach it." Schoenberg shook his head. "There is no column. The roads are gone. The bridges are gone. We're all that's left." He looked toward the open doorway, where snow drifted in like white sand. In the distance, artillery flashed on the horizon, silent at first, then rumbling through the ground like a slow heartbeat. Reinhardt followed his gaze. "You think they'll break through to the Rhine?" "They already have," Schoenberg said. "We just haven't heard it yet." December 30th, 1944, near Streetvith. Morning came grey and bitter. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. They were discovered by accident, a reconnaissance unit from the US 99th Infantry Division, sweeping the back roads. The first sign was the distant hum of engines. Then came headlights cutting through the forest gloom, a column of jeeps, and M3 half-tracks creeping up the road. "Positions," a sergeant hissed. The German soldiers scrambled for cover, their movements sluggish with cold. Rifles were raised, bolts drawn back. Schoenberg stepped outside into the open road, hand raised. "Hold your fire," he barked. His voice carried authority that the forest obeyed. Reinhardt stared at him. "Sir, what are you doing?" "Ending this." He stepped into the middle of the road, snow crunching beneath his boots, and waited. The lead American jeep rolled closer, its driver squinting through goggles. A soldier manned the mounted, .30 caliber machine gun, finger resting lightly on the trigger. When the headlights finally illuminated Schoenberg's face, he stopped walking. His uniform torn, mud-stained, dusted with frost, still bore the eagle and the iron cross. His right hand was raised in surrender. He called out in English, the words slow but steady. "No fight. Regiment finished. We surrender." For a moment, no one moved. The American gunner hesitated, glancing at his lieutenant. Then, slowly, the jeep coasted forward. Behind Schoenberg, one by one, his men stepped from the shadows. 67 figures in white and grey, weapons slung, helmets removed. Their breath rose like mist. The youngest carried another soldier's rifle slung across his back, a weapon he no longer had the strength to use. An American sergeant shouted, "Keep your hands up! Drop all weapons!" Schoenberg nodded once, turned to his men, and said quietly, "Do it." Rifles clattered onto the road. The sound echoed in the still air like the closing of a door. An hour later, the Germans sat lined up in the snow beside the road while American MPs catalogued them. A pot of coffee boiled over a small fire, the smell of it drifting temptingly through the air. A young American corporal approached Schoenberg, offering him a tin mug. "Hot? You look like you could use it." The Oberst accepted it with both hands, nodding once. "Thank you." He took a cautious sip. It burned his tongue, and yet it was the best thing he'd tasted in months. The corporal crouched beside him. "What outfit are you from?" 105th Panzergrenadierregiment, Schoenberg replied. His voice was calm, almost weary. The corporal scribbled it down. "Never heard of it. You boys put up a hell of a fight, though. Thought you'd run out of everything by now." Schoenberg stared into the steaming cup. "We did." The American laughed softly, not understanding. "Well, you're lucky you ran into us, not our flyboys. They've been tearing up the roads all week." The Oberst gave a faint smile. "Lucky," he repeated, tasting the word like irony. He looked past the young soldier toward the convoy of American trucks, clean, well-fueled, brimming with crates of ammunition and food. It was the same abundance he'd seen at the depot days earlier, only multiplied tenfold. He set down the coffee and said, almost to himself, "You could fight this war forever." The corporal frowned. "What's that, sir?" Schoenberg didn't answer. He simply stared at the endless line of vehicles stretching down the road, engines humming steadily, an army made not of flesh, but of factories and fuel. 2 days later, the Ardennes offensive officially ended. The German retreat was total. In American after-action reports, the engagement at Trois Ponts was barely a footnote. Small enemy units surrendered without resistance. But for Oberst Hans von Schoenberg, it was the quiet moment when illusion gave way to truth. He would spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in France. He never returned to active command. When interviewed years later, he spoke rarely of the battles, but often of the depot at Stavelot. "That was the day I understood," he said. "We Germans were fighting men. The Americans were fighting with an empire. We could destroy their tanks, kill their soldiers, burn their cities, but we could not kill their capacity to begin again." He paused, staring at the floor, as if seeing that warehouse once more, the endless rows of fuel drums and chocolate bars gleaming in the frost. "You can win battles," he said finally, "but you cannot win against a nation that manufactures victory." April 1945, Germany. The Reich was gone. Cities lay in ruins. Trains had stopped running. The radio that once shouted triumph now whispered defeat. And somewhere across the Atlantic, in factories still roaring day and night, ships, planes, and tanks continued to roll off assembly lines, even though the war that demanded them was nearly done. The machine that had broken the world would not stop. It had simply changed hands. And in that machine's cold perfection, Oberst Schoenberg's words echoed the confession of a soldier who had glimpsed the future through the open doors of a warehouse in Belgium. "They can fight forever.